Okay, so what did we read? We read about the birth, and then we talked about last week. We spent a lot of time on verse 28, which was the love. Isaac loved Esau because his game was in his mouth. We discussed that seems to be a love that is dependent on a reason, but Rebecca loved Jacob, and that's sort of unconditional. We also pointed out that the English translation here fails the Hebrew, whereas with Isaac it says loved in the past tense. With Rebecca, it says ohevet, present tense. And in biblical Hebrew, present tense is also continuous. So in other words, the love grows over time, as opposed to with Esav, because it's dependent on something, it's sort of past tense, it's not increasing, it's not dynamic in that same way. Okay, then we discussed, but back at verse 28, we mentioned that Isaac loved Esau because his game was in his mouth. And we discussed what that means. There's two interpretations in Rashi. Number one is because he brought him food. He brought him game. He brought him the game that he hunted. And therefore, if you read it that way, his mouth is whose mouth? Is Isaac's mouth, right? Esau brought game to Isaac's mouth. That's one interpretation. The second interpretation is that Tzayid, game, comes from the word hunting, trickery. Esav tricks his father. And therefore, his mouth, in that sense, is whose mouth? The game, the trickery, is in Esav's mouth. These were the two interpretations in Rashi. Yeah, according to the second interpretation, he's being tricked. The first interpretation is, no, he likes steak. My father likes steak. You bring him steak. There was somebody who told me, I'm not going to give names here, but he told me he got into a very serious argument with his father, very serious fight with his father. It was big. And he went to get some advice from a friend what to do. And his friend told him, what does your father like to eat? Just go and eat with him. That's all. Don't talk, don't argue, don't debate, just have a meal. And that's where their relationship started the rehabilitation. So the point here is Esau understood that truth. So according to the first interpretation, you got to eat together. Eat together brings people together. The Hasidim know this. That's why they say the Chaim together, spending time together, it opens up the heart. So that's the first interpretation. Second interpretation, Esau is more, he's tricking his father and he's trying to present himself as someone who he's not. Now, last week we mentioned the Medrash, and the Medrash says that how did he trick his father? He tried to present himself as a pious person. Says the Medrash, he asked his father, Seth remembers this, he asked his father, how do you tithe the salt? And also, the Medrash says, same Medrash is, how do you tithe the salt? How do you tithe the tevin? How do you say tevin? Tevin is the hay. In other words, not the stalks of grain, not the kernel which you're going to eat, but the leftover, the hay which you give to the animal. Why was that so blinding to Isaac? Because these are things that in Jewish law are not obligated in tithing because they're not substantial, right? So what you have to tithe is your grain, your produce, but the straw is not very significant.
Why didn't you know that?
It's a good question. So that's part of the question. Before we get to the question, what's the Medrash saying? The Medrash saying is Isaac is so impressed. Wow, this person wants to tithe even things that are not obligated in tithing. So that presents himself. He's so religious, right? You don't have to tithe the hay, but he wants to tithe the hay. You don't have to tithe the salt, but he wants to tithe the salt. That's the Medrash. Now, Seth asks a very interesting question. Why didn't he know that? In other words, what I'm going to say what Seth's question is, Seth, correct me if I'm wrong, that question does not show piety or does not show that he's a learned man. To the contrary, that question shows ignorance. You don't know that. You don't have that. It's not obligated. So why is he asking this question? So that leads the Hasidic commentaries in all different interesting directions. And I'm going to read a commentary right here that says that this is really captures the essence of the philosophy of Esav and how it differs from the philosophy of Jacob. His question of how to tithe the salt and how to tithe the hay really captures Esav's spiritual makeup. And the reason why the Hasidic commentary says this is because of all the mitzvot he could have asked. There are 613 commandments. There's so many other mitzvot he could have asked about, and the only one he asks about is about tithing, and specifically about the grain and about the grain and not the grain, the hay and the salt. So they want to say that something is very, very significant here, and this gets to the heart of Esav and his mistake, and Isaac understanding and trying to affect Esav. So this is going to be a big idea about the relationship between Esav and his father and Esav and Yaakov. I'm opening up my notes. I want to read it inside and try to translate the best of my ability so I can preserve as much of the flavor as possible. And then the treat is, I remember, oh no, Steve Davinsky is not here, but he asked that we talk about the Maharal. So right after this is the Maharal, which also is sort of on the same perspective. Assuming my phone will work and open. In the meantime, comments, questions, please share.
Maybe Esau didn't know that he couldn't.
You don't have to tie the salt.
Yeah, maybe he just did it.
So his father should have said.
Okay.
His father should have said, "Go to Hebrew school. Listen in Hebrew school. What do you mean? How do you tie the salt? Don't you know they don't have to tie the salt?" Well, so one interpretation is, well, he's trying to present himself as someone who does beyond the letter of the law. So he says, "Look, I want to tithe even things that are not obligated." Okay, so that's not a question. Say you want to tithe the salt. Here he's saying, how do you tithe the salt? How do you tithe the grain? So this means that there's a deeper interpretation here. The question is what that is. So I'm reading a little bit here from a Hasidic commentary called the Shemi Shmuel, but a lot of other Hasidic commentaries say the same point. So he says like this. He says, everything in this world, if you want to think about this world, everything in this world, you have to think about it as what he calls tafel and ikar, which is Hebrew for the secondary, and the main purpose. Everything has the main purpose and the shell. And one way to think about the world in general is that everything in the world, all the physicality in the world, all our physical possessions are really tafel. They're secondary to the ikar, to the main thing. What is the main thing? The main thing is our spiritual life and our spiritual connection to God, right? And he says that's our view of life. This whole life is secondary. The whole physical life is secondary to have our spiritual life. You could think about it in time. The 6 days of the week, the 6 days of the week are necessary, but they're secondary for our purpose. What is our purpose? When do we celebrate our purpose? That is Shabbat. And everything in life, you could ask yourself, is this a means to an end? Is this tafel? Is this secondary to something deeper? Or is this the ikar? Is this the main thing? And he says as follows. He says that the true, even in the physical sense, you have a peel, right? You buy a fruit. So the fruit has a peel, and the fruit has the body of the fruit. And we discussed this a lot when we discussed the story of the tree of knowledge. Every fruit needs a peel to protect it. The problem is when you get confused, then you don't realize what is the fruit and what is the peel. In other words, what is supposed to serve what? So the proper way to live life is to understand the difference between what is secondary, what is serving something deeper, and what is the point and what is the essence. Now, Esav, okay, from perspective of Hashem, Yaakov and Esav are okay. Let's go before that. Is the peel good or bad? Is physical life good or bad? Is material possessions good or bad? Okay. It's a trick question. The answer is it depends. That's like all the answers. It depends. If you view it as the goal, it's negative. It's certainly going to mislead you. But if you view material success as a tafel, as secondary for a deeper idea, for a deeper way of life, for the spiritual life, then not only is the physical possessions not negative, it's actually conducive. It's productive. It serves. It's part of the fruit. It serves the fruit. And then it's wonderful. Okay, so look at the father. The father sees Esav and Yaakov. He sees them as, I don't want to say this, but peel and fruit. In other words, his job is to succeed in the material realm, and job is to succeed in the spiritual realm. hopefully they could be like the peel and the fruit in the sense that they influence each other and they serve each other. What is the problem? The problem is that Esav sees his role of succeeding in the physical realm. He sees that role, he sees his role as independent. I don't want to serve something else. I don't want material success to serve a higher purpose. I don't want material success so I can support my brother. I want the peel to be the main thing. In other words, he's flipping the external and making the external the goal. And that's the mistake that unfortunately, many people make, but Esav is the epitome of that mistake. Now let's go back to talk about this medrash. What does Esav ask? Esav asks, how do you tithe the hay and how do you tithe the salt? What does hay and salt have in common? Hay, it's much easier to see with hay. Hay is external to the kernel. Why do you have the hay? Why do you have the stalk? Because the kernel has to grow. But you understand that there's the main thing and there's the secondary thing. Now, why does Jewish law say that the hay does not need tithing? Why does the Jewish law say the hay doesn't need tithing? Because hay is not important. It's only secondary. So you tithe the main thing, which is the kernel. You don't have to tithe the hay. You don't have to tithe the hay. Same thing with salt. Why does Jewish law say you don't have to tithe the salt? Because salt itself is not significant. Salt itself is supposed to serve something else. Salt you put in the dish. So you tithe the dish. You don't tithe the salt. Salt is supposed to serve something else. So Esav comes to his father and he says, what he's really saying, either consciously or subconsciously, is, why don't we give more attention to the hay and the salt? Now, what that is doing, really, it's saying, from Jewish perspective, that it's hay and salt are only significant if they serve something else. But Esav says, no, I want, Seth, you can close it. But no, it's just making noise. You just hit the button that says on off. But Esav says, I want to give significance to that which is secondary. And that's expressed in his statement, how do you tithe the salt and how do you tithe the hay? It's not just a question that he's trying to trick his father, but it's really a question that captures his perspective on life. How I want to give significance to something which is supposed to be only a means to an end, which something is supposed to serve a higher purpose. And again, the higher purpose, the secondary thing is only healthy if it's serving a higher purpose. If you make what was supposed to be secondary, if you make that the main thing, then everything is inverted, and that leads to negative results. Now, the father sees Esav, and we'll get to the story later. The father wants to bless Esav, of course, because the father wants Esav to be the peel, to be the shield that will protect his brother. And the physical success of Esav will protect Yaakov. But what is Yaakov? But Esav is not in the game. Esav doesn't want that. And that's why mother says this plan is not going to work. Now, that's Yaakov and Esav. But a takeaway for us is really have to think about everything in my life. Is everything in my life, is it secondary? What is secondary? What am I looking for as a means to an end? And what am I looking for as an end to itself? In other words, what's my priority? Now, I spend a lot of time doing things that are not really the ultimate priority. It's just here to serve my priority. But the problem is if I lose my focus and I give and I consider what is supposed to be secondary, I consider that the main thing, then my life is out of balance. And then the peel is dangerous, because the peel is dangerous if you want to eat it. It's very good if it's serving the food, right? So in other words, if I have all the elements and I understand what is serving what, then I live a healthy life. But if I confuse what is supposed to be secondary and I make it a primary, then I'm confusing the fruit for the peel, the flesh of the fruit to the peel, and then I end up with a life that is self-destructive. And that, unfortunately, was the story of Esav according to the Hasidic commentaries. But all this is expressed, I think, is a beautiful idea. The Medrash, remember, the Medrash doesn't say everything explicitly; it just alludes to it. So just by saying hay and wheat, hay and salt, the commentaries explain, what's Esav? Esav is looking at the hay and the salt. He's looking at something secondary and considering it primary. That's a big mistake. That captures Esav's, that's the tragedy of Esav. Whereas from the father's perspective, what is supposed to happen is Esav is supposed to realize, I am the hay, I am the salt. I'm the purpose. I don't have to tithe the hay and the salt because I'm here to serve the greater, the spiritual Jacob and Jacob's values. So that I think is just to tie up to what we said last week. And I think this is a very beautiful thing because everybody could apply it to their life and say, what am I doing as primary and what am I doing as secondary? Now, the secondary things are important and they're good and they're holy. Like it's the 6 days of creation, provided that I understand that 6 days of creation are here to serve the Shabbat and not the other way around, right? Two people take a break on Shabbat. One person takes a break on Shabbat. I have to rest so I can go back to work in the 6 days. So Shabbat is serving the 6 days. The other guy says, no, I have to work. So on Shabbat, I will be able to have time to devote to spirituality. It looks like they're doing the same thing. The division of time in their life is the same thing, but the perspective and the attitude makes all the difference. Go ahead, Vicki.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi, for taking my question. The first thought we have when you talk about hay, the hay is animal food, right? So right away you see his priorities. And the second question is about Isaac. Did he actually see that the Asaph has his priorities flipped?
Yeah. So
was he overly optimistic, or
according to the Hasidic commentaries, they don't accept, not only Hasidic, others as well, Shamshin Paul Hirsch and others. No, they don't want to say that Asaph was that Isaac was so gullible that he didn't see through his son Asaph. I mean, he knows that Asaph is sitting in the tent and hunting all day, running around in nature, not devoting time to spirituality. So he asked him one question, so he fooled him. I mean, you have to really your view of Isaac has to be that he's really, really gullible to be able to fall for something like that. And therefore, the Hasidic commentaries, but other commentaries as well, maintain that Isaac wasn't fooled. But nevertheless, Isaac loved Esau because Isaac saw Esau's potential to be the partner of Jacob. And in what sense? That he is going to be the external and Isaac will be the internal. But both are necessary. Esau is external in the sense of the peel of the fruit. In other words, I'm amassing physical success, but I'm doing it for a higher purpose to support the values of Jacob. And that's Isaac. Isaac insists, he doesn't give up hope. We'll talk about this later about the digging of the wells. Isaac never gives up hope on Esau. That's the beautiful thing. And he's somewhat successful, as we'll see later in the story. So Isaac never gives up hope. He never does. And that's actually a beautiful, beautiful thing. But at the end of the day, it's very painful to understand, but sometimes parents have a limited influence on their children, certainly adult children. And children make their own choices. And you could be Isaac, and you can be influencing your son and loving him and showing him the right way and never giving up on your son. But your son chooses to check out. That's unfortunately, that's the problem with adulthood, right?
It doesn't say that Isaac at all made a big effort. It doesn't say it. He just accepts everything and he says, this is the way the boy is. But nowhere does it say that he tried to be a father and teach the
So I want to address
right
that.
way.
I want to address that. Seth says nowhere does it say that Isaac is going out of his way to take care of Esau, and I agree. But listen, but let me explain where I'm coming from. There are precious few statements in the Torah, very, very few incidents about Isaac. It's not like Abraham who has 2 portions, not like Jacob who has 4 portions. Isaac has barely 1 portion. Even in that portion, most of it is his children. He's very little. We know almost nothing about Isaac. The only thing we're going to say about Isaac, he digs wells and he loves his son Esau. That's all it says. So what does that tell you? That tells you that when the little information, the little information that we have about Isaac, whatever it says about Isaac is significant. It's not something he did once. Right? Because if I say, this guy sells potatoes, that's the only thing I know about his life. I know that's what he did constantly, right? So I agree with you that there's not a lot of real estate, not a lot of stories that discuss how Isaac loves Esau. But all I know about Isaac is he loves his son Esau, and when he's old and he feels like he's going to die, he wants to bless Esau. That's all I know about it. I know nothing else about him. I know digging wells, but we'll see digging wells Kabbalistically means digging wells is consistent with the love of Esau. So my answer to you is you're right. does not say a lot of time, doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Isaac's love to Esau, but because there's precious little written about him, every word, and then every sentence is significant. That means that it captures a lot of his life. Okay, so that's what I was saying. I was saying that Esau never gives up on his son, but Isaac never gives up on Esau. But at the end of the day, he wants the partnership. He wants Esau to understand that I am secondary and you are first. And Jacob is first, but Esau doesn't want to be secondary. He says, I want my material success to be primary.
If you're anybody, if somebody says to you, you're second compared to a brother,
Yeah,
you're going to be
so
very
let
angry and offended.
me fine tune what I mean by first and second, but a very good point. And that's why Esau said, let me fine tune that point. For that, Mark writes like this: living with the times. Unequal love dealt with in this week's parsha with unloved wife's son. Yeah, this week's parsha, which we're going to read on Shabbos, it says if a person has two wives and the hated one gives birth to an elder son, you have to lo yuchal baker. You cannot consider the younger son, the son of the beloved wife, to be elder, but you have to give the elder portion to the older one, who is the son of the unbeloved. There are commentaries who write that mitzvah is indirect. Okay, there are commentaries who write that all the stories of Genesis. Why do you have the stories in Genesis? Okay, it's good history. Okay, it's good lessons, but not in the book of Torah. Book of Torah is the book of law primarily. So there are people who say that if you think about it, all the mitzvot in the next 4 books or 3.5 books are in response to this first book and a half of the stories. So if that's your perspective, then some people say that mitzvah in this week's parsha, to give that the older son will always be the older son, and even if he's the son of the hated, you have to treat the older son and give him the right of the firstborn. Some people say that's in response to the story of Jacob's trying to buy Esau's birthright and of Jacob trying to love Joseph more than Reuven. So that's related. Okay, Seth says nobody wants to be secondary. That's correct. Let me tell you a story. Story is like this. Later on in Jewish history, the Jewish people come to Israel, and the Jewish people live there for 400 years. Eventually, they create a kingdom. In other words, they're not 12 separate tribes, but they unite as a kingdom. Samuel appoints a king, first Saul, then David, then Solomon. Okay. After Solomon, there's the 10 tribes secede, and that's the split within the Jewish people. It's a very terrible split, not only because it's not only a political split, it's also a spiritual split, because what happens is Yeravam, who was the king of the 10 tribes, doesn't want the Jewish people going. He was the northern kingdom, 10 tribes. Doesn't want the people going to pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, because then they'll be influenced by the southern kingdom, by the house of David. So what he does is he creates 2 idols, one in the north and one in the center, and he says, we'll go to idol, we don't have to go to Jerusalem. And therefore he introduces the constitution. In other words, the bedrock of his kingdom of the 10 tribes is idol worship. And for the rest of Jewish history, about 200 years, till as long as that kingdom lasted, until it was destroyed and the 10 tribes were taken to exile, there was tremendous amount of idol worship in the kingdom of the 10 tribes, in the 10 tribes. Now, there is a story in the Talmud. The story of the Talmud is God comes to Yeravam ben Nevat, who is the leader of the 10 tribes who seceded. And he says, why don't we all make peace? And God, you, Yeravam ben Nevat, the leader of the 10 tribes, and Ben Yishai, the son of Yishai, the son of Jesse, which is David, we'll all be together and we'll all stroll in the Garden of Eden. Right? What could you ask better? We're all going to go. We'll all be together. God, David, and Yeravam. Well, how wonderful! Everything was fine. But the Talmud says like this. Talmud says, Yeravam says, "Mi barash, who's in charge? Who's first? Who's first?" So God says, Ben Yishai barash, the son of Yishai is first. David is first. You have to be secondary. So you know what Yeravam said? No deal. I'm off. I don't want to be secondary. And that's the point. Nobody wants to be secondary. Nobody wants to be second. But let's think about this for a second. What does it mean to be second? Be second doesn't mean I'm less of a person. The question is, Same question, what serves what? The 10 tribes were actually the kingdom of the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom, was much more successful in the material sense. They had more wealth, they had better relations with the surrounding nations, they had a stronger army, okay? So you build, the kingdom of the 10 tribes represents the physical might of Israel. What does the southern kingdom represent? Jerusalem, the spirituality. They had a very small kingdom, was not as powerful, but they were more spiritual kingdom. And basically God says, why can't we just make peace? Why can't we have that the 10 tribes, the wealth of the Jewish people, will all be together with the spiritual side of the Jewish people? Why can't we all be together? And then let me finish. Theoretically, what your Rambam is saying, okay, but what's the priority in the Jewish people? What's more important? And God says, what's more important is the goal. The goal is the spiritual. The physical might that Israel may amass is a wonderful thing, but the physical might and the physical wealth could never be the goal. The physical might and wealth have to serve the southern kingdom, what David represents, and they say no. And they say no, we don't want it, we're not interested. So secondary doesn't mean I'm less important. You can't have a fruit without a peel. Secondary means I have to know my place, and the place of physical might and physical success. If you put that as the goal, that is not the Jewish way. And you can have that. They were arguing about it in Yerav and Benevat, and they have it in Israel today. You have Israel, you have Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem. You have the might of Israel, even the wealth of Israel, even the technology of Israel. And then you have the spiritual side of Israel. And the question is, they can't make peace. They are fighting each other all day. The question is, could we make peace? Could the physical might of Israel and the technological might of Israel understand that the purpose of the success? What's the purpose of the success? Purpose of the success is to cultivate the spiritual. Now, unfortunately, the fight is both ways. The spiritual rejects the physical, and the physical rejects the spiritual. But that's a political problem, and that's a very deep problem. But the goal is for both sides of the coin. In other words, both the peel and the fruit, to understand that we're all here for the same purpose. But to be all here for the same purpose, everybody has to realize their role. And you can't have you can't have any function. You have to understand the place of everything. And in our life, it's the same thing. What is secondary? What is primary? What serves what? That's how you get to wholesome peace. That's the story in short.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
the second part of my question was Rebecca more practical, and as far as understanding the priorities and the capabilities of children.
Yeah. So what is that? Repeat it, please.
Was Rebecca more practical as far as understanding what her children are capable of doing?
I think the answer is yes. In other words, Rebecca, I don't know if practical is could be the word. It's practical. Could be the word is realistic, or maybe even some cynical. Remember, Rebecca is coming from an environment where she sees that in her family there were people who were less than morally upright. Her brother is Lavan, right? Lavan is the ultimate trickster, takes advantage of his own family, etc. So Rashi discusses how the Medrash discusses how she is the rose that grows up amongst the thorns. So in other words, she is exposed to a lot more negativity in her life than what Isaac is exposed to. And therefore, I think Isaac is beautiful, but Isaac is a little bit naive in the sense that he realizes, okay, so why can't we just make peace between the physical and the spiritual? What's so hard? He doesn't realize that part of that there's a real tension here, that the drive, once a person is successful in the material realm, it's very difficult to introduce the values of spirituality when someone is so in other words, the values of materialism don't easily fit with the spiritual values, and it takes work, and maybe it may take time, it may take centuries to learn how to make peace between the physical and the spiritual. right? So yes, it's a nice idea. It's like in today's world. Imagine you say, "Oh, I want to just bring democracy to the whole world." It's a wonderful thing, but sometimes it takes time because the values don't really line up. It takes time for people to make peace between these values. So I think that Isaac is much more optimistic, but maybe that's part of a certain sense of being naive because he's not exposed to the culture, to people who are challenged in that sense. Whereas Rebecca, because of her background, she sees people in a more realistic light, perhaps. Again, this I'm just saying I'm just saying what it appears to me, but may or may not be wrong, may or may not be right.
Thank you so much. I think you gave me more than an answer. It's also like a reason for them acting that way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Based on their background.
You have to look at the background, right? Any amateur psychologist would say, look, you have to look at the person's upbringing to understand their perspective. So I guess I'm trying to do the same thing. Okay, I made a commitment to read a little bit of the Maharal. Problem is that Steve is not here, so I'm going to have to tell Steve to repeat it to him privately. But let's read it. But let's think about the Maharal for a second. So who is the Maharal? The Maharal was a great sage, very prolific writer. He lived in. He was the Maharal Rabbi. No, the Lamed is for Lowy. Rabbi Yehuda Lowy was his name, and he was a great sage, and he lived in Prague. And again, he was one of the few people in his time in Eastern Europe at the time in the 16th century, who is great sage in both parts of Torah, in the revealed part of Torah, but also in the mystical and Kabbalistic part of Torah as well. Most of the Kabbalistic work was being done in Sfat at the time in Israel, in the Sephardic communities, but the Maharal himself also was a great sage in the Kabbalah and also in Jewish philosophy. And he was a very prolific writer. Sometimes it's hard to understand. You have to really think deeply about what he's saying, but that's the Maharal in short. Unfortunately, the Maharal is more famous for the Golan that he created, the legend that he created, the Golan, more than for his actual teachings, but you have to study his teachings as well. Okay, what does the Maharal say? The Maharal is going to say, remember, the Maharal precedes the Hasidic movement by a few hundred years. Actually, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, is the 7th generation descendant from the Maharal. So I guess that the Hasidism has been influenced from the Maharal as well. Okay, so the Maharal has a lot to say about the story of Yaakov and Esav, but I want to think about the ideas consistent with what we said earlier, secondary, what is external, what is internal. So the Maharal says something very interesting. First of all, let's go back for a second. What is this business of, as we're going to see in a minute, that Yaakov wants to buy the birthright? How do you buy the birthright? Either you're born first or you're not born first. It's a strange thing to try to do. So there are all kinds of interpretations. We'll get into that, some of that a little bit later. But what the Maharal says is like this. Usually, whoever's first is first. What do you mean? If you're second, you can't become first. How do you buy the first right? You're second. How do you become first? You can't do that. But the Maharal goes on this Kabbalistic principle of fruit and peel, same thing that we mentioned earlier. In other words, Yaakov and Esav are not, they're twins. So even though Bob said last week they're not identical twins, but spiritually they're identical twins. Spiritually, they're one entity. That's why they were born as twins. Why are they not identical? Because they're extreme. I will try to address that in a minute. But they're one entity. So now the question is the fact that you're born first, right? If you have the peel of the fruit and the fruit, your one entity is all the same fruit. So the fact that you're born first, the Kabbalah says, klipa kodemes lepri. Always the fruit, the peel precedes the fruit. That's what the Kabbalah says. So in other words, if you're talking about two entities, then what is first means it's primary, closest to its source. That's why usually from the Kabbalistic perspective, the firstborn son is the closest to the father, and therefore they're considered the firstborn. So if you have two separate entities, being first means that you're first. You're closer to the source. But if you're one entity spiritually, and you're one entity that splits in two, then being first doesn't mean you're first. So now the question is, Yaakov and Esav are one entity, both born. Now they have to establish, Yaakov and Esav, between the two, have to establish who is the Bechor, who is firstborn. In other words, who is closest to our father? Is it the spiritual side, which is Jacob, or is it the physical side, which is Esav? And that's why when Yaakov comes in a few verses, Yaakov is going to come to Esav and says, sell me your birthright. Well, you can't sell a birthright. What he's really trying to say is, please acknowledge that the domain that I'm invested in, which is studying Torah and the tense, is primary, and the domain that you're involved in, which is going out hunting, is secondary, in that it's further from our father. It's what serves the spiritual. And that's what he wants from him. He wants an acknowledgement that in between these two, not I am primary, but what I am engaged in is primary. And that's what the Maharal says. That's why that's the meaning of buying the birthright. Otherwise, buying the birthright has no meaning. What does it mean you buy the birthright? But in this context, spiritually speaking, because they're one, and they're not two separate entities with two separate life missions. They're really supposed to be like the peel on the fruit. One is supposed to serve the other, external and internal. Esav is external, Isaac is internal. Esav is external, Jacob is internal. Now we have to determine, we both need to realize what is first, what's closer to our father. That is the first thing he says. Seth has a question, take the question, we'll go back to this. Go ahead.
It seems to me that Jacob is really not doing anything very spiritual at all. He's using money, which we say is secondary. He's using money
to try to buy the birthright.
And that's not spiritual at all.
Right.
He would have been better off telling him the truth and saying, I feel this way.
Right.
Would you support me?
Right.
That's a spiritual way to
Good
do it.
Good point.
Not doing it with money.
Good point.
And offering him like that. So he's not such a great guy.
Good point.
No offense to anybody.
No, he's my grandfather, and yours too. So I'm trying to defend it.
He's not my grandfather.
He is your grandfather.
Okay.
He is your grandfather. Yeah, we'll have to analyze Jacob. Jacob is
That's okay.
No, but good point.
He didn't do anything so spiritual.
Point well taken. What we know about we know in the beginning, what it says that this man is a man running in the field hunting, and the other one is someone who sits in the tents. And even later in the story, Isaac says, okay, we'll leave later in the story for a moment.
As a matter of fact, if he believed it was so spiritual, then he would absolutely believe that this would take care of itself and God would fix it.
Yeah. But the beauty of the Maharal's interpretation,
I'm not saying you got a bad interpretation.
No. The beauty of what I love about the interpretation is, because in this sense, whether you like it or not, the way he did it or not is another story. But when he's coming to his brother and says, sell me your birthright, what he's saying is, could you please recognize?
But he didn't say it.
He may have not said it explicitly. He may have.
Trying to be difficult, but he didn't say it.
Let's think about this for a second. And remember, not everything has to be stated. When you have an interaction and my brother comes to me and says, do me a favor, sit on the other side of the table. We understand that certain actions can have a lot of meaning and it doesn't have to be stated, and people realize that there's tension. So my point here is that, at least according to the commentators, the transaction here, what they're discussing, has much more. There's a lot more emotion involved. Right? I come into somebody's house, and it seems to be simple statements could be layered with years of emotion and years of tension. And I can't just look at what they're saying superficially. I have to realize what's beneath. What are they really saying? That's the real question. What are they really saying? Okay, so let's go back for a moment, just to finish Maharal's point. Let's go back to a moment and talk about the transaction. And remember, the takeaway is supposed to be like this. Esav is looking at the external. Jacob wants to say, Esav, you're very successful and you're very good and everything is fine, but realize that there's something internal, which is the spiritual, that the external success is supposed to be serving. That's what the Maharal's argument is.
He's belittling his brother, which is really aspiritual.
Critique taken.
I'm not trying to be difficult.
No, critique taken. We'll get back. We'll get to Jacob in a minute, but I wanted to highlight one point. What do I want to point? Remember, it doesn't say a lot about Esav. So whatever it talks about Esav, we have to realize that this is telling. Just like the Medrash said about the salt. It's telling. It's very telling. So let's talk about this conversation. Verse 29. I think I shared the screen. Yes. So it's chapter 25, verse 29. On the art scroll, it's page 127. Now Jacob cooked a pottage, and Esav came from the field, and he was faint. He was tired. Now, later I'll give the classic commentators, what the commentators are saying that they were sitting Shiva for Abraham, but let's leave that alone for a second. And Esav said to Jacob, pour into me some of this red pottage, for I am faint. He was therefore named Edom. Why Edom? Edom means red. And Jacob said, sell me as this day your birthright. Esav replied, behold, I'm going to die, so why do I need this birthright? Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. And he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. Okay, wonderful story. A lot to talk about. It can be upset some people. It's wonderful. What is the funniest thing about the story? Think about it. Okay, I'm going to tell you the story. We read it so many times we don't think about this. Here's the story. Once upon a time, I walk into Seth's house, and Seth says, what do you want for lunch? I say, I want the orange juice. So Seth says, okay, from now on, your name is Orange. It's ridiculous, but that's exactly what the Torah says. It's exactly what the Torah says. He walks in and he says, and Esav is faint. And Esav says, can I have some of the pottage from the red pottage? And the Torah stops and says, therefore, his name was Edom, and Esav's name is Edom. If you look later, he lives on Mount Seir, is Mount Edom. Esav's name, the name of his descendants become, we're Israel, they're Edom. Why Edom? The Torah says, you know why he was called Edom? Because when he walked in, when he was age 15, and he walked into the kitchen, and Jacob was making a pottage, he said, could I have some of the red dish? Oh, wonderful, your name is red. I mean, what is this even saying? What does this even mean? What do you do with this verse? Okay, I understand. He asked for the red. He was tired. He couldn't really discern what's going on. But that's why you're going to name him Edom. It's just the strangest verse you can even think of. It's even funny. In fact, I can make a skit on this. You can get some good laughs. So the Maharal says, no, remember, listen, this is a very deep idea. It's a very, very deep idea. The guy comes in, and what you want to show is that Esav is always looking at the externality of things. He's never looking for the deeper meaning. Therefore, even when he asks for the lentil soup, he doesn't come in and say, give me the lentil soup. According to the tradition, he's eating lentil soup. Nazir, lentil soup, or whatever the case is. He doesn't say, can I have soup? He says, can I have the red? What does it mean? He is affected by the most external layer of reality. That's why they called him Edom. Why do they call him Edom? Because what does Edom represent? The color. And color is the most external realm of reality. In other words, this event, that when he walked in at that fatal day, which we'll talk about that, it was the day of Abraham's death. So this is a very important day. And he walks in and he says, doesn't say, how's everyone doing? Grandpa died. When is the Levaya? When is the Siva? He says, can I have the red soup? Can I have the red? He is looking at, according to the Maharal, again, he's looking at the most external layer of reality. And that's why they named him Edom, because this is not a simple one-time event. This event is telling about the nature of Esav. He's looking at the external. He's looking at the physical, not the spiritual. Even within the physical, he's looking at the color more than the dish, right? Little kids, what do they want? Which cereal do they want? The one that's more colorful. That's why the advertisers know this. And that's why the cereal boxes are very colorful, okay? So the point here is, this is a telling story. It's telling about Esav's personality. He's looking for the external. He's looking for the physical, not looking at what's deeper. And that's why he gets that name. And that really captures Esav's point. Now, therefore, Yaakov says, okay, you want the external? You want the external? Can I have the Bechorah? Can I have the birthright? What's the next thing he says? Steve, I'll take a question in a second. What's the next thing he says? What's Esav's response? If your brother asks you to sell him the birthright, what does Esav say? Esav says, I don't need the birthright. Why not? Esav replied, behold, I'm going to die. So why do I need this birthright? What does it mean, behold, I'm going to die? Everyone's going to die. Right? What do they say? No one ever survived life. Everyone's going to die.
He said he was exhausted.
That was before, but he was exhausted, so he wants the red. So he says, I'll give you the red if you give me your
When you're
birthright.
exhausted, sometimes you feel like you're going to die.
No, he says, I'm going to die. So what do I need the birthright? We'll talk about that later. He was exhausted, but he took advantage of him. We'll talk about that later, the legal aspect of that in a second. But let's hang on for a second. Let's finish with the Maharal. Remember, it's all one Maharal. Says the Maharal like this. Esav says, I'm going to die. What do I need birthright? What is he really saying? He's right. He's going to die. Everybody's going to die. Because for Esav, what is significant is the physical. The physical is going to die. Everyone's going to die, but everybody has the body that dies and the soul that's immortal, right? So the question is, what do you value? If you value your body, you value this physical, then he said then you're going to die. If you value the spiritual, then you're not going to die. In fact, the Talmud says about Jacob, Yaakov Avinu lo mes, Jacob our father didn't die. In other words, you look at yourself, you could look at yourself externally, then I'm going to die. You could look at your soul level and you're not going to die. So what Esav says is, don't talk to me about birthright, which is a spiritual concept. I don't believe in spiritual. I don't think about spiritual concepts because I just look at the physical, and therefore all I know is I'm going to die, and therefore I'm just here for the here and the now.
Yeah.
That's fine. Let me finish. Let's give the Maharal some space. Then we could disagree. Let's give him some space. So that is the what the Torah is trying to project when it talks about Yaakov and Esav. So we're going to let Steve ask a question. Then I think Zach wants to ask a question. And of course, we're going to give Seth the last word.
No, I have nothing.
And then 21, we'll see if we have any time to keep going. Go ahead, Steve Straight, please.
Thank you for giving me the next to last word. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Now, some people trace the Golem story with the Maharal from a Yiddish novel that a very early Yiddish novel, and they say that the Maharal was too centralist to be associated with this fringe concept of the golem. However, whatever case, the connection of the golem with the Maharal still continued in tradition, although maybe it stems back to the novel as opposed to the Maharal itself. But when the Nazis entered the synagogue in Prague, there's one story that they heard noises on the roof, which scared them, and they ran away.
Right.
And so perhaps, but anyhow, that tradition that is associated with the Maharal did continue. However, in reality, it may have stemmed back to a Yiddish novel as opposed to the Maharal itself,
Right.
which they claim was too centralist to deal with those fringe ideas of a golem.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I'm not an expert on the Golem or the Maharal, but I would say if you need to find a rabbi in Eastern Europe at that time that you could at least involve in the story, I understand why they would pick the Maharal, because he was a Kabbalist. So I agree that maybe you see what I'm saying. You need someone that the story has to stick. So you need someone that's a Kabbalist. I would also say when we were growing up, we had the story with the Golem, and the Golem was supposed to protect the people of the Jewish community from the blood libels, and he would patrol the city, make sure that there's nobody comes to plant dead Christian bodies. So I'm sitting here in 2021 thinking to myself, it's less important if there was a Golem or there wasn't. It's more important if the Goyim thought there was a Golem. Right? So if people think you have a golem and you don't have a golem, it's just as effective as if you do have a golem. But that's another story. And that ties to your second story. If the Nazis walked into the synagogue and they believed there was a golem, then it's just as effective as if there was a golem. Or there wasn't a golem, I don't know. I wasn't there. But I'm not an expert on this. But thank you, Steve. Go ahead, Zach, please.
Me?
Yes, please.
It's always interesting to see the root of current problem in Torah.
Yes.
There is an obvious problem, especially right now, but I think it was through centuries. Then people are manipulated and tricked, and then respected lawyers and politicians would come forward and explain that it wasn't trickery, that they deserve to do it. Here, it's funny that the guy, obviously, one was tricked and maybe joked or something, and then there are wise people come around, and this guy who tricked him, manipulated, somehow comes out as good guy, and people explain, oh, he's good, he's virtuous, he's much smarter, and whatever he was doing. And just to give one contemporary example, somebody whose name shouldn't be ever mentioned said, Russia, if you are listening, then send this emails to us. And boom, we have many years investigation, and serious people, politicians would come out and say, this is a treason, he clearly asked something. Exactly the same situation.
I don't know how to respond, but I will respond that guilty as charged. In other words, that's exactly what's happening here. In other words, the reality is that when you read the story, it seems like that Jacob is less than forthcoming. And there are very smart rabbis over the centuries who are defending Jacob. And I'm not done defending him. I'm just going to give you one more example how we defend him before I even continue the point. So guilty as charged. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. What do you want me to say? The answer is yes. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? The answer is yes. Why the rabbis do this? I don't know. Some people think that the reason why the rabbis do this is because when the rabbis, you have to understand the way they study the Torah, the rabbis see Esav, they see Rome. They see Rome, they see Western civilization, Western Europe, and Rome that persecuted the Jewish people, and to terrible persecution, including the rabbis themselves. Many of them were killed by the Roman Empire, right? So they need to have to understand, they have to view, they don't view this as chance. Okay, the mighty Roman Empire was obviously very, 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 what's the word I'm looking for? Very, word I'm looking for is very, no, I mean to say very, very violent, and they killed all their oppressors according any threat, including the Jews. No, that's not the way Jews look at history. Jews look at history is that there's a reason, there's a purpose, there's a struggle, there's good, there's evil, there's meaning to history. Okay, and when they're looking at their own story, the story of Rome and Jerusalem, starting with the sages of the Talmud, going all the way to the classic commentaries, who are also under terrible persecution and usually on the run from the ears of Rome. So they're looking to understand the conflict between Jews and Christianity. They're trying to find some vocabulary or some story, or some context to understand this. And what they see this as Yaakov and Esav. And therefore, Esav, it's a tricky story. On one hand, we say he has tremendous potential. That's why Isaac wants to bless him. We're going to continue to, his potential is immense. And later on, we'll see that at some point they make peace, temporary peace, but they make peace. And the sages view that as unbelievable because that's the foretelling of the end of history. When the Jewish world, when Judea and Rome make peace, when the might of a physical force, physical technology, and the physical sciences will make peace with spiritual ideas. So they see Yaakov and Esav as a very optimistic story. But in the middle, there has to be terrible tension, and Esav has to represent the forces of start as positive, but because they're so focused on material might, they're going to become corrupt temporarily. And now I'm not telling you if this is the story that you see when you read the Bible or not. That's not my job to tell you what to think. My job is to tell you how the rabbis saw this story. And I agree with you. And I'm guilty as charged. That's it. I can keep defending Jacob, and we'll do that next week. But yes, that's the story. But why should I'm guilty? You caught me. You caught me. What should I say? I hope I didn't make it worse. I at this point we'll do the math in a second. Zach, I don't know if you in fact I think you may have frozen, but if you want to respond, please do. Vicky, please go ahead.
Well, I don't know if that's my turn or not, but I wanted to comment and maybe answer to both Seth and Zach. And I know maybe that's already in commentaries that we're going to discuss later. How I see the story is just Jacob is trying to speak to Esau in his language. He couldn't just come, as Seth said, just, there are priorities in life. He wouldn't understand this conceptual level. So that's how I see it. He doesn't need to be defended. On the contrary, he understands his brother better than his brother understands himself.
Yeah, I could defend Esau again. I could say a lot of things about the story. I'm just reluctant because everyone, you're going to look at me and say, well, you're just doing what the rabbis are doing. So for that, I'll say, well, I'm in good company, so that's okay. Think about this for a second. Let's talk about, there's a genre where you say the story and you say, what would be the alternative alternative end of the story? So here's an alternative end to the story. The alternative end to the story is, I'm Jacob. Esau comes into the house tired. And again, according to the sages, this is a time that Esau is supposed to be in tune to the family. We read it next week. It's the death of Abraham. It's the Shiva. The whole family comes. And this guy's coming and hunting and he's tired and he wants food. And he's like, dude, you're the firstborn. You're supposed to be making the soup for everybody. Okay? So we'll talk about that later. But the bottom line is, Esau, maybe alternative interpretation. Again, I'm going on my own limb. The rabbis didn't say this. I'm just making this up as I go. So bear with me for a minute. If it flops, it flops. Jacob wants to shake Esau up, and he says, "Dude, you got to check into what's happening." So he tells him, "Could you sell me your birthright for a thing of soup?" What's the alternative response? If you didn't know the story, and I tell you that Esau comes into the kitchen, and Yaakov tells him, "Sell me your birthright." What should Esau do? Esau would say, "Are you crazy? I'm not selling my birthright for a bowl of soup." And then what would Yaakov say? "Ah, beautiful. That's exactly what I wanted you to say." Right? In other words, sometimes the absurdity of the offer is that itself is supposed to awaken Esau, but it doesn't. So it doesn't. That itself is telling. That means this guy is not somebody. And Esau says, "I'm going to die. Don't talk to me about anything abstract." And you have people like that. You start talking to them about something abstract. They say, "I don't want to hear. I'm going to die. The only thing that matters to me is the physical." And that's why he defines himself as someone that's going to die. If you believe in abstract, you're not going to die. Jacob doesn't die. At least that's what the sages say. Yaakov Avinu lo meis. Jacob never dies, because for Jacob, the way he self-defines, he self-defines by the soul. Esau self-defines by the tangible. So Esau is like, "Don't talk to me about birthright. I'm dying." Meaning what he's saying is, I'm going to die. Meaning the only thing that matters to me is the part of life, part of reality that is physical, and therefore is going to die. So all I'm trying to say is, you could look at Yaakov trying to take advantage of his brother, and it could be that's right. And in a minute you'll see that. In a minute you'll see there's okay. I'm going overtime, but why not? I'm going to go. I'm going to go one more minute. I'm going to go one more minute. I apologize. The verse says like this. The verse says, after the story, it says like this, verse 34. And Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of toils, and pottage of lentils, and he ate and drank and arose and left. And Esau despised the birthright. What is the ending?
Sorry, Rabbi, was disconnected.
Yeah. So let me finish this point, and we'll go back to your point. So the sages say, what does this mean that Esau despised the birthright? What does it mean? Why do you have to say it here? So the answer is, if somebody's under this duress and the guy's starving and he sells his house and he writes off his house to you, it's of no legal value, right? Because he says, "I sold it to you because I was starving." The point here is, even after Esau ate, he ate bread, he ate lentils, he ate and drank and arose and left. Even after the whole thing, he didn't come back and say, "Hey, you cheated me." In fact, he despised the birthright. He says, "I don't eat it." When he wasn't hungry anymore. So that's telling that it wasn't Jacob taking advantage of it. Okay. I don't know when we fell off, Zach, but I hope you heard that I agree with you. In other words, that I'm guilty.
Yes.
That you heard. That was another thing.
That's the only thing I heard.
That you heard.
It's okay. I understood your point.
No, my point is this. I also, like I said, my point is that, I don't know if you heard the rest, but my point here was that the sages viewed this story as they have to understand the conflict between Rome and that was persecuting the Jewish people. They have to understand it in the context of history. There has to be meaning to the suffering, right? That's very important for them. So therefore, this story, where Esau, Rome, has a tremendous amount of potential, at the end of the day is going to make peace, but in the meantime is super, super focused on the external of life, on physical might and physical force, to the extent that they become totally disconnected from spirituality and that they're here to oppress their brother. They like that story. They need that story to understand history. And this is the sages of the Talmud, who themselves suffered from Rome directly, and they felt Rome was a direct descendant of Edom, but also true about the classic commentators, who are Maharal included, who are in Western and Eastern Europe, but see themselves as in Europe, which is the spiritual heirs of Rome. So that's that is how they see the world. Now, whether or not you see this in the actual story, that I already told you, I'm guilty. I'm in good company with the rest of the rabbis. So at least I'm in good company.
If I may, just quick comment. I agree that some occupations, spiritual or physical, may have advantage in some people's eyes over other occupations. That's not a problem. Or some professions like veterans, teachers, firefighters. But once you start telling me that because there is advantage of this activity or this occupation or this profession, I can take something from you, which I consider lower level, then I get pissed off immediately.
Yeah, so I'm comfortable with that, and that's why I can't take. He has to buy, and also buying doesn't help him. He has to negotiate with his father, and he has to try to cheat. You can't get it without that person's recognition. But what he's really trying to do is not take something from his brother. What he's really trying to do is okay. Let's accept the premise, assuming we believe the premise, not that one occupation is better than the other. That's not what we're saying. In your life, you have to have physical blessing, physical possessions, and spiritual. If you didn't eat breakfast and lunch, you're going to die, right? So there's not a question of what's more important, putting on tefillin or eating breakfast. There's not a question. You have to have both. That's not a question. You have to have material wealth and you have to have spiritual wealth to be a healthy human being. That's not a question. It's not a question of one and robbing the other. The question is, from the perspective of the sages, the question is, which one is the goal and which one's the means to an end? And it's in my own life, when I have multiple things, it's important for me to understand what is serving what. And the sages feel my physical blessing has to have a higher purpose. And if it doesn't have a higher purpose, not that my neighbor could steal it from me, but internally, it's not going to lead me to a wholesome life. And that's why Esav cannot be the bearer of the legacy of Abraham. Not because, whoops.
You meant not physical, but my moral.
Yeah, moral. But I'm saying, but Esav therefore cannot become the spiritual heir of Abraham, not because he has a few dollars, but because he doesn't understand where to place his physical wealth in his own life, right? What should be serving what in my own life?
Yeah, but Jacob's doing the same thing.
Let's deal with Jacob in a minute.
No, we
Okay.
can't.
According to the
That's the
sages,
Jacob
okay,
that-
according to the sages, Jacob is a guy who would be much more comfortable, and actually the story supports this, much more comfortable in the tents. He doesn't want to buy the birthright. He doesn't want to make the soup. He doesn't want to steal the blessings. His fact, as you see clearly,
He's doing
one second. His mother completely pushes him to steal the blessings. He doesn't want it. In other words, his perspective, he would much rather say, yes, let Esav be successful in the material world, and he'll protect me, just like God wanted with the 10 tribes and the southern kingdom, where Israel, the kingdom of Israel, is successful materially and militarily and physically, and they'll protect Jerusalem. And that's all the way it should be. The problem is, at least from the perspective of the sages, when Esav is not in on the deal, he doesn't want it. He says, I want my wealth and my own thing. I'm going to the field. I'm not part of this family. Father says, you're the oldest one. I'm going to bless you so you have success, so you protect the family. That was the role of, when you say firstborn, when you say firstborn in biblical times, that's what you meant. You get the most blessing because you're here to protect the family. Once the father's dead, who's going to protect the family? The firstborn. The brother says, it's wonderful. I just don't want to be part of this family. When the whole family's mourning, I'm checking out. So then then Jacob has no choice, and he has to step into the role. And part of it, as Zach says and Seth feels, is being less than honest. And that's the story. I can't get away from the story. That's the story. But to say that this is something that Jacob is led to because the original harmony between the brothers collapses because the brother says, I don't want to be the firstborn, because firstborn means I'm part of this family. I don't want to be part of this family. I want my success to be my own personal success and my own personal goal. I'm not here for the family. So that's what we see.
But we
Asa,
touched-
that's what we see. Let me finish the point, and you have the last word as always.
I don't want the last.
No, I want to give it to you, but I want to say the last thing. The last thing I want to say is like this. What I want to say is that, of course, Jacob was less than perfect. There's no question about that. Of course, he makes choices that are less than perfect. There's no question about that. But the question is, in the essential story of life, which is, does he realize that his material success is secondary to the spiritual? On that question and that question alone, he has the right perspective, and therefore, over time, him and his children self-correct. They're not perfect. They make mistakes in his generation. The next generation, they sell Joseph as a slave. This is not a story about perfect people. But the question is, who does God choose? In other words, who's going to bear the legacy of Abraham? Somebody who understands that in the question of what is secondary and what is primary, they understand that the physical is here to serve the material. Does that mean they're a perfect person? Of course not. Does that mean they're going to fail? Yes. But it also means that they're going to self-correct over time. That's my pitch. Take it or leave it. Seth, go ahead.
I'm not gonna give the last word,
Why not?
because I don't want to.
Oh, you think?
All right, I'll give it,
Take it.
all right, because I want to make you happy.
Yes, thank
That's
you.
what Jacob didn't do for his brother. We touched on this last week.
Yeah.
Esau's mother, as he grew up, she favored
The younger one.
Jacob.
Yeah.
And so Esau, no wonder he doesn't want to be in the family, because he's not wanted. So
Right.
what do you expect? And then Jacob makes it worse by rubbing it in and trying
Yeah.
to take. He makes it worse. So it's not Esau's fault.
No.
And Esau, they both were inexperienced and naive people.
Correct. And that's
the truth.
that's a true
in my
story.
view.
That's the true story. They're both imperfect, and that's why it's going to take from that point on thousands of years until the brothers reunite in peace and harmony. And that's the story of human history from the perspective of Judaism, right? This is not a pessimistic story. The story didn't end. The story didn't end. We're still working for the reunification of the brothers. And we have a little bit of it in a few portions from now, but the end of it is going to be in the Messianic era, when physical might, physical technology, physical blessing understand that there's a higher purpose, and that which is morality and decency, and that is the Messianic era according to Judaism. So, is this a story of a perfect family? Of course not. The story of Genesis, our story is
Yeah, but he got the birthright.
our story is a dysfunctional family. We are a dysfunctional family. There's no question. From the first generation, second generation, and third generation, Ishmael is chased out of the house. This guy steals his brother's blessings. The next generation, they sell the brother as a slave. We are dysfunctional. There's no question about that. The question is, what do we make of it? How do we grow? Are we stuck, or are we improving over time? And the question is, who's going to lead which brother is going to lead the improvement? So what we're saying is, ultimately, Jacob teaches Esau, maybe not in their lifetime, but ultimately Jacob teaches Esau the correct priorities of life, that you need physical success, you need material success. The Roman Empire needs to be able to advance society, culture, sciences. But the question is, you need to understand that there's spirituality, that there's purpose, that there's meaning, there's values, morals. That is what Jacob represents. Okay, there's a lot more to say. We could be here forever. So I'm going to take Bob's question, and I'm going to have to call it a day. And God willing, we'll continue next week, same time, same place, in good health. Go ahead, Bob, please. Thank
I'm
you.
only asking a question, so it's for Seth, so he doesn't feel like
Okay.
he's had the last word.
Oh,
So this
oh,
is
yeah, thank you
completely
for-
for
Thank
his thing.
You can have the last.
Thank you for providing.
There
Thank
you
you
go.
for providing the service. Thank you.
I'd like to make an obstetrical and philosophic observation.
Thank you.
Twins are 1 per 100 deliveries. It's inconceivable that this is the only set of twins that we hear about. And my thoughts are about it is that this is a spoiler alert. If you listen to your teachings on Tanya on Fridays and all that stuff, we're always talking about the animal and the spiritual. So here is a story right in Genesis to tell us all that this is kind of a linchpin of future teachings for us to think about. Because when you think of it, what is the teachable moment of this twin delivery? It's to talk about the animal and the spiritual, the klipa and the internal, the seed, the fruit and the cover. I don't know. I just like your thoughts, and to see if the Maharal or any other
No, I
philosophic.
fully agree. I just want to point out that it's not the only twins in Genesis. There's twins, the children of Judah and Tamar. But I would say that the Torah is fascinated by twins. Whenever there's twins, there's a story. There's always a story, and a very similar story. That story there is that, you're going to tell me it may not be possible. You're the doctor. I'm not going to argue with you. But that story there is that the first older son sticks out his hand first. They tie a red scarlet around his hand to know he's first. He then puts it back in, and then his younger brother emerges called Peretz, and they say, they named him Peretz. Why did you burst forth? And this one was called Peretz because he bursted forth. That one was called Zerach because it shines. He's got the scarlet on his hand, and they live happily ever after. Now there, they're both righteous. Peretz becomes the forerunner of the ancestor of King David. So it's a very similar story where here Jacob emerges, the second one emerges holding the ankle of the first. They're trying to fight who should be first. So it's a very similar story. But the bottom line is Torah is fascinated with twins. I agree with you that we already alluded to it earlier in this parsha, that there it says te'omim, both full. It says with the vav and with the aleph. There both were righteous. Here it was less than righteous. One is physical and one is spiritual. And I agree that, as you see, we're talking about this story. We're not looking for the villain and the righteous person. We're looking internally, and we're saying in our own life. That's what I said about the Maharal, our own life and the Hasidic interpretation. We need to look at. We're not destroying Esav. We're not saying Jacob is the only twin. You must have both. You must have the fruit and the tree, and the fruit and the peel. The question, but the peel is healthy when it realizes it's a peel. In my life, I have to realize that the material blessing, material success is secondary. It's here to serve a higher purpose. If I make the means to an end, if I make that the end, if I make that the goal, then I'm not living the spiritually wholesome life that I'm supposed to live. That doesn't mean that the physical has no value. It doesn't mean that it's secondary in the sense, no, it's one. It's one. It's one. It's one entity. The physical and the spiritual are one. One is internal, one is external. So that we're part of one entity. That's the key here. The question is, what is external, what is internal? And you can't say, I just care about the internal. It's like saying, I just care about my soul, I don't care about the body. If I don't care about the body, I'm dead. On the other hand, if I just care about the body, I don't care about the soul, there's no soul, I'm dead too, right? So there's no question about, it's not a question of, we're not looking for the good and the bad, we're looking for the balance. And the rabbis see this as the story of history. And the story of history, we have a tension between material success, advancement of physical might, physical technology, physical sciences, and the other side is the advancement of spiritual goals and spiritual and kindness and peace and morality. And the goal is that they both realize that they're not in conflict. But that goal has not yet been fully realized. We're on the way, we're getting there. It's much sooner, it's much sooner than later, and we're much closer to the goal than we think we are. Then much closer to the goal than we think when we open up the TV. That's what we believe. What are you going to do? We're optimistic people. I'm sorry. Okay, that's the story in short. Sorry for keeping you extra. You came to study on Labor Day weekend. And here I'm keeping you over time. All right, I apologize. Wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Rabbi.
Thank you.